Good early evening, East Coast USA. Good afternoon, West Coast. Salam alaikum for those who are watching in Syria and Turkey. And good morning, May 9th, to those in Australia. I'm Stanley Heller for RPM. I'm host of the weekly TV program, The Struggle, and author of Zionist Betrayal of Jews. We have an exciting and a very necessary program for you today, a fight back against the crude, rude, bogus, so-called anti-imperialists, those who have done so much harm to the fight for democracy and equality. Crude in that they only oppose US imperialism, and in doing so, they line up in support for the despots all across the world who are outside of the US orbit. As you no doubt understand, this is not a Zoom meeting. It's a webinar. We'd love to see your faces, but for security and other reasons, we're holding it in this fashion. You will be able to ask questions and make comments in the latter part of the program. Just write what you want in the Facebook page or the YouTube page in the comment section. After the presentations, we'll send comments to the speakers. Each of our speakers will have some short remarks, and then I'll ask them some prepared questions. And for the final third of the webinar, they'll respond to you. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to note that the event's main sponsor is RPM, the Revive the Peace Movement Network. It was founded in 2016 to reverse the US left's generally dismal inaction on Syria. Our website is rpm.world. We have posted on it two letters, one from Latin Americans and another inspired by Syrians, activists angry at the crude anti-imperialists. Their letters are one reason we're having this forum. Now, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, Linda Quiquivix. She's a popular educator, geographer, and translator based in California. She is a daughter of the undocumented migrant community in California and granddaughter of the MAM, or better known as the Maya people of Guatemala and Mexico. She places her university training as a geographer at the service of under-resourced communities in Palestine, Mexico, and the US who seek clean water, land, and tools to build autonomy. In her hometown of Oxnard, California, she is part of a collective of seed savers and farmers who intervene against food insecurity, rebuild respectful ecological relationships to Mother Earth, and collectively organize towards climate resilience. She's also a writer and researcher currently working on a book manuscript entitled Palestine and the Wretched of Empire, Race, Cartography, and the Afterlives of 1492. It traces the uses of cartography and international law in Palestine, Israel, to show how movement leaders come to replicate domination when the world of empire becomes the starting point for politics. Then we will have as speaker Michael Karadjis. He teaches social sciences and international development at Western Sydney University in Australia. His involvement in political activity began when he marched against the Vietnam War as a young high school student. In recent times, he's been involved in a number of solidarity campaigns, including that for the Bosnians of former Yugoslavia, the Palestine Human Rights Campaign, Syria Solidarity Australia, and Agent Orange Justice. Now, at this point, I was going to introduce our third speaker, Shiyam Galyon, but she has suddenly taken ill, and that's a real loss. She's a tremendous activist, a woman involved in the Syrian women's movement, and she is a worker for the War Resisters League, but we'll have to hear from her at another time. So we will now begin with Linda Quiquivix. Linda, could you give us some of the fundamentals of the situation and some of the vocabulary that we should understand?
Thank you so much, Stanley. Thanks to the organizers for this space. I do a lot of popular education here at home in Oxnard, and I found that it's been very helpful to try to tease out some of the terms that we use when we're talking about events in the world and resistance movements. And some of the terms that come up quite a bit are terms like the left versus the right, and what is capitalism and what is imperialism. And I think that it can be really helpful if, when we have these conversations, if we can talk about what our working definitions are of these terms, because these terms, they don't really have meanings, they have uses, and they have different kinds of uses. And for example, when we think about leftist politics, a lot of the time we think about anti-capitalist politics. That's like, well, that's if you're in the rest of the world. In the United States, it's a little peculiar, because in the United States, there are really just two options, which is the conservatives and the liberals. And the liberals are understood to be left, and the conservatives understood to be right. But if you go to much of the rest of the world, they would understand both the liberals and the conservatives to be right-wing, because they're both pro-capitalist as an example. And in the United States, anarchist movements, communist movements, socialist movements, a lot of them were destroyed in the early 20th century, leaving most people with just these two options, although the more leftist movements, anti-capitalist anarchist movements, continue to exist more underground, and more since especially Occupy Wall Street and forward. So when we think about left in movement spaces, we usually are talking about anti-capitalist movements. Sometimes it seems though that the term left is being used to talk about anything against the United States, as if the United States is the only capitalist regime in the world. But before moving on, I kind of want to start with an illustration, if I may, about how I teach about what capitalism is, using Karl Marx, his work, and especially on the commodity form and the labor theory of value. And so an illustration that I found very helpful in this work of popular political education is illustrating logics inherent in capitalist relations. And I usually talk about, as an example, I'm a maker of paper and you're a maker of pencils, and we encounter each other, and one day we decide it'd be really nice if we can get into an exchange. But because if we were living in a non-capitalist society, we might just gift each other those things. We don't really need to exchange them for their equivalent value. But under capitalism, there needs to be an equivalent value. And so you and I might try to figure this out by asking each other, well, how long did it take you to make those pencils and that paper? And I'll say, well, it took me an hour to make a ream of paper. And then you say, it took me an hour to make 5 pencils. Okay, I'll give you my hour for your hour. And then we've conducted the exchange. So that seems a pretty basic mode of exchange under capitalism. If we want to be critical, though, and by critical, I mean investigating what the assumptions are in that transaction, then we can understand a little bit more how capitalism functions. One of those assumptions is that you and I are equals. We're equals in terms of our labor time. 2 is that you and I are property owners. I am the property owner of pencils and you of paper, or the other way around. When we conduct the exchange, we will continue being the property owners of those items. We didn't have to ask or bargain with anyone else outside of us. And then 3 is that we can hold on to contracts. We can keep contracts. No one's going to call the police and accuse anybody of stealing anything because we've conducted this exchange. So equality, property ownership, and contracts, which is the basis of liberal law. classical liberal law. There's a greater assumption in all of that, though, that very often does not get talked about, and that is the assumption of that that can arise when we ask the question, what about the tree? The tree did a lot of work to create itself so that paper could be created from it, so that pencils could be created from it. But did we ask the tree? Did we seek consent from the tree? Did we get into some kind of equivalent exchange with the tree? And most of the time, and actually in capitalism, no. The answer is no. It's very different from from native cultures all over the world that do have ceremonies where they ask permission to trees before they're cut down. If the tree was going to be involved in this exchange under capitalist equivalence, then we would have to figure out the value of the tree's labor in creating itself. But not only that, if we really understand how trees grow, it's not just a tree that produces a tree. It's soil microbes, it's water, it's pollinators, whether it's the wind or whether it's like a squirrel that hit an acorn and forgot where the squirrel hid the acorn, and from it sprouted a tree. All of that is a lot of work. Mother Earth does a lot of work in creating the world. And what capitalism needs to do is devalorize most of the work so that it can extract profit. And so then here, if we understand capitalism in this way, in this deep, deep way, we can understand how, for example, there can be racialization under capitalism, where enslaved people are not understood as anyone whose labor time is equivalent to someone else's, who is not a property owner, who cannot engage in contracts. It would be the master engaging in contracts over the enslaved person's work. Enslaved people have been treated very much like objects of nature, and therefore devalorized under capitalism. And this logic continues in a lot of ways, although there's been struggle to valorize more and more workers. And so here we can have at least two different definitions of what capitalism is. And I see in a lot of movement spaces more definitions that are more focused on the injustice of those human laborers not getting the full worth of their labor, that it goes to the boss. And so then there's a movement that seeks redistribution of those wages back to the laborer. But it still continues having this split over the human and the non-human, over whose work is valorized and whose work is not valorized. And then there are broader conceptions of what capitalism is, and a lot of these come from indigenous movements all over the world, but not just. A lot of feminist movements as well, especially ecofeminists, that talk about the problem of capital isn't whether it's redistributing profits equitably, it's that it even creates this division over objects and subjects, over valorization and devalorization, and which is creating then a climate catastrophe that we see now, the massive ravaging and pillaging of Mother Earth, and of course of colonized peoples who are understood to be closer to nature and not very close to the modern human, under humanism, under Western ideas. And so then that's important, I think, when we talk about an anti-capitalist politics, to have shared concepts, or at least debates over our working definitions of how we understand the world to be functioning, how we understand capitalism to work. In terms of imperialism or anti-imperialist politics, which we see a lot, especially in critiques of the United States, rightly so. The US is an imperialist power in that it expands outside of its borders in order to continue extracting profit from the world. Before the US, there was Britain, that was the great imperialist power. And France was part of that too. Many European countries were imperialist powers. It's interesting too to understand how we use this term imperialism as well, because there are debates that talk about how imperialism, if we're using it to talk about a nation state, a specific nation state's activities outside its borders, then we might be missing how nation states work together for capital, for global capital. This was actually something in the early 1970s that Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, developed in his theorizations. He said, we used to be Black nationalists first, and then we realized that we needed to connect internationally. So we became Black internationalists. But then we realized that empire has gotten global, that the US is an empire and its reach is global, and it's far bigger than just the United States with this military machine. It's really functioning for the benefit of global capital. And if that's the case, we can never create a Black nation state. And so then they moved from being Black internationalists to intercommunalists, talking about organizing in terms of communities that are networked all over the world, not necessarily through the nation state container. And so then it's been really interesting to see this debate play out in recent decades, especially with discussions about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism having many definitions. One that seems to speak to me the most is one that talks about how sovereignty has shifted away from the nation state, if it ever really had it. And the nation state is now playing an administrative role, a managerial role, kind of like an overseer role for global capital. The Zapatistas in Chiapas and Mexico have an analysis about the global plantation, about how nation states are serving as overseers and in their borders. It's a plantation that functions for global capital. And that's a great reason why they also see, like the Black Panthers in the 70s saw, that it's not possible to take the state if we're really going to be a leftist movement, an anti-capitalist movement, because the state international system functions in a way of agreements, of international agreements, and those agreements move forward the imperatives of capital. And so it's been really fascinating to see movements like the Zapatistas grow and inspire so much of the world since their uprising in 1994, and especially in the years that followed, because they tried a lot of things. They tried to create another political movement to take the dominant ruling dictator party, the PRI, out of office. They tried to get into negotiations with the government. These things didn't work until finally, with the stage that they're at now, that they've been on since 2005, which you can find in the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandon Jungle, where they invite anyone. They're like, we're tired. We're not going to talk to the above anymore. We're going to talk to movements from below who are dedicated or who are committed to creating a world where many worlds fit, where there isn't going to be one way imposed on everybody. And they take very seriously the idea of the below, of believing that people themselves can govern, that we're all equally intelligent, that we all have the capacity. We just need each other's superpowers, as a collective, to be super strong. And so what they've done that's been, I found very helpful, is that they have split the left. They call themselves the left from below, in distinction from the left from above, where the left from above is that left that doesn't really believe that everyday people can govern themselves, believes instead that there needs to be an educated elite that knows better and will impose socialism, for example, on everybody else, imposing sameness on everybody else, rather than respecting difference. And so I think with that, I can leave it there, and then we might be able to have some more conversations that harken back to these terms, and hopefully what I've presented has been useful.
Great, thank you so much. Now we're going to turn to Michael, and want to talk about the split in the left. The split, it didn't just start in the last couple of years. The attitudes that have been manifested towards countries like Syria, Russia, China, it didn't start in the last decade. Can you give us some history?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, look, maybe I'll just take off from what Shiyam was just saying about, not Shiyam, Shiyam's not here. What Linda was just saying about this split between socialism from above and socialism from below, these two perspectives. And so where did this start? Well, there's different perspectives on how far this went back, on how far this goes back. I mean, from one perspective, this goes back to this goes back to the split after the Russian Revolution between Stalinism and anti-Stalinism. So that, okay, we had those supporting a Stalinist perspective, that defending every action of the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union, all the horrendous repression, the great purges, and so on in the Soviet Union and other so-called socialist countries, while opponents of that were the Trotskyists or anarchists and anarcho-communists and libertarian socialists and whatever they were called, condemning these regimes as violating the most elementary principles of socialism, because the most elementary principle of socialism is, of course, power of the working class, understood to mean the vast majority of the population. Stalinists defended these regimes from the point of view that perhaps they're not perfect, but they are socialist in their economies. They've got full employment, free healthcare and education, and so on. And that, yes, maybe there's some things wrong, but that's simply because of the era we're living in and because they're surrounded by capitalist countries putting pressure on them and so on. Now, this viewpoint was wrong even at the time, but perhaps we can understand where it was coming from back in the 1930s. The West was in its Great Depression, and while Stalin was carrying out this horrendous, frightful repression, this was decades before the internet, or even decades before mass media, mass TV viewing, and so on. And so wanting to believe in a better society, it was probably easy for a lot of people to believe that all the stories about repression in the Soviet Union were just propaganda. Therefore, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, this kind of Stalinist left had nothing. Everything was gone. So they transferred the same method, this method of slavishly giving apologetics for dictatorships. They transferred that now to any dictatorship that supposedly had some kind of conflict with US imperialism. No matter how real, or in the cases of, say, Milosevic and Assad, purely imaginary, right? Regardless of the fact that these regimes had nothing to do with socialism, they were simply dictatorships or repressive regimes based on the rule of big capital. So if we can say that before 1990, this kind of thinking was at least theoretically connected to some idea of a connection to a better society, no matter how mistaken, after 1990, there's no connection whatsoever. Essentially, this form of leftism is defending regimes which are often fascist-like in their nature and in their actions. In addition, as this was already decades after the advent of mass media and now fully into the age of the internet, the excuse of not knowing, of claiming it's all Western propaganda no longer holds. I mean, like in Syria, for example, I mean, thousands of people have, made direct film footage, this direct accounts from, thousands of Syrians themselves, from refugees, from there's film footage of, people in protests and being gunned down and so on. I mean, this is not, you can't say this is all propaganda and claim you don't know what's going on. They know full well what these anti-working class dictatorships are doing, yet still go out of their way to defend them. But while this might be a continuation in some senses, from another perspective, this is an entirely new thing. And the interesting thing is, it's not simply the old traditional Stalinist groups that have transferred from one to the other. It's even a lot of other leftists that didn't have a traditional connection to, being slavish followers of the Soviet leadership or the Chinese leadership. There's even a lot of new leftists that are coming out and supporting this kind of politics, having no connection to socialism or to the working class, even theoretically, but only a disemboweled so-called anti-imperialism with no content whatsoever, can also be seen as an entirely new development in the post-Cold War world. We'll probably discuss this anti-imperialism more a little bit later, but just to say that this was a new ideology in the way it was put forward, I think. In the past, anti-imperialism at least had some connection to anti-capitalism. And which is what Linda talked about, and I agree with the perspective she's put forward here. And it was related to the fact that peoples of the global south were and are oppressed and exploited by global imperialism. In its new rendition, let's go to the 1990s, when this became very obvious. People like the Bosnian Muslims and the mixed Bosnian populations in the big cities like Sarajevo. In the 1990s, they were simply resisting a massive military onslaught by heavily armed Serbian nationalism. Heavily armed because the Serbian Republic within the old Yugoslav Federation inherited all the weaponry from former Yugoslavia, which didn't all belong to one of its republics, but that was Belgrade, so they inherited it. They were able to throw all these massive weaponry of the ex-Yugoslav army against the completely unarmed Bosnian Republic and unarmed cities, and by simply defending their cities, by simply trying to save their lives, to protect themselves from an actually declared attempt at destroying them as a people, that is attempted genocide, they now became slandered as agents of imperialism for defending their lives. While those leading the genocidal onslaught were deemed as anti-imperialist fighters. Now, how or why could this development take place? Mostly it was due to nothing other than a lot of verbal condemnation of the Serbian onslaught by the West. Why was the West engaged in verbal onslaught against Serbia? Well, given the level of massive instability this was creating right in the heart of Europe, in the heart of the new European Union and all the rest of it, with millions of refugees being created, more than half the population of Bosnia uprooted, and the expressed concerns of European leaders that if there was no kind of compromise, the Bosnian Muslims would become a Gaza in Europe. Yes, they did feel the need to condemn. And yet, despite these concerns, neither the European Union nor the US did anything to aid the so-called imperialist-backed Bosnians. And by the way, let's just can that myth right now that there was intervention in Bosnia. There wasn't. There was intervention at the end of the Bosnian War, which gave the Serbian Republic 50% of Bosnia. That was an intervention just to seal the deal. Let's be very clear. In fact, right through the 3.5 years of the war, the main action of the West, of the US and the European Union, was to enforce with their navies in the Adriatic Sea, to enforce an arms embargo on the Bosnian Republic, on the besieged Bosnian Republic. And the onslaught by right-wing nationalism was led by Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, who was the very leader who had led the overthrow of actually existing socialism, the Tito model in Yugoslavia. The ideology of Serbian nationalism was the antithesis the former Yugoslavia's ideology of brotherhood and unity, however real that was the ideology because it aimed to keep a multinational federation together. So it always tried to dampen down the nationalism of powerful republics like Serbia or Croatia. And Milosevic, of course, was surrounded, like Assad today, surrounded by cronies who were the new mega capitalist class of this new Serbia. You can name them. This one was head of the private telecommunications company, and so on and so on. So what content was there? There wasn't even a theoretical content of supporting a regime like this, let alone these kinds of actions, which would normally be called racist, ultranationalist, and in practice genocidal, let alone condemning the people defending themselves as being agents of imperialism for defending themselves. And thus an anti-imperialism that turns traditional notions of leftist solidarity with the oppressed on its head. This is what we've seen again in the last decade with Syria. In fact, it's actually all deja vu, as well as there being lots of other cases and examples in between. And it's interesting that we've just seen now Grey Zone, one of the leaders of this sort of so-called anti-imperialist kind of thinking, now coming out in support of the Burmese junta as it mows down protesters with using all the same kind of reason, all the same sort of rationale. I'll just leave it there for now, I think.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Very, very good. Now, Shiyam was going to talk about some of the impacts, and I'm going to take over and tap dance a little bit. Just to name a few of the countries and a few of the things that I can remember off the top of my head, because it's really important to get concrete about this. Of course, Syria, the uprisings, the people who tried to fight for democracy and equality against the regime. First, they had to fight against Assad, then ISIS, and then the Western deniers, the people who would question with minute detail any kind of facts that was reported in the media. So what was it, August of 2013, in one day, 1,400 people are gassed to death with sarin gas. And we saw scores of bodies of children just laying there. And people seriously said, well, we think maybe those are actors. And 5 years later in Ghouta, there was chlorine dropped, and I forget the number, 60 dead, something like that. We had a petition by so-called intellectuals just a month or two ago saying that the UN should really be so concerned about this one particular attack. I'm sure it's been incredibly demoralizing for people in Syria who would expect the left to rush to their defense to have to face not only Assad and ISIS, but these deniers. Recently, something about Lebanon, a man named Lokman Slim. I did an interview just a couple of days ago. One of the people, these deniers, called him a collaborator just a little bit after he was assassinated with 5 bullets to his head. And what were the defects of this man? Well, he was a Shia, but he criticized Hezbollah. He was concerned about what was going on in Assad's prisons, and he criticized the Lebanese elite who persisted in ruling the country no matter how many disasters they caused. Go to Latin America, Nicaragua. You have a president in Ortega who came from revolutionary origins, but rules now on his own will. His vice president is none other than his wife. And in 2018, when there were big protests, hundreds were killed in Nicaragua. Venezuela, I remember this absolutely infamous video of Max Blumenthal at a time when hundreds of thousands of people just could not live in the country, were running away. There was a super inflation, and just people were in utter misery. And he's in a supermarket saying, there's tons of stuff. Look at this. And he points to all the things that were for sale, not even noticing that he was practically the only person there. China, the Uyghurs, Muslims, who have been considered now enemies of the people, thrown into basically prison camps. A lot of people call it genocide, where Islam is basically considered something wrong, evil, something that has to be suppressed. And finally, Iran. Iran, which has the highest rate of execution in the world, which sent troops in early against the Syrians in their uprising. Iran, which has thrown all sorts of their top labor leaders in jail, and which persecutes their ethnic minorities. There are some of these bogus anti-imperialists who, defend Iran. They say, U.S. shouldn't go to war against Iran. Yeah, absolutely right. But then they go much further and appear with the foreign minister of Iran, and all kinds of really denialist things. Anyway, so those are a few things. Maybe we can get into those in the questions coming from the viewers. But right now we want to go back to the panelists. But before that, I do want to mention two things. One, about RPM, do a little commercial. First, our email, which is the number 2, rpm@mail.com. And I hope that'll be put in the chat. 2rpm@mail.com. Please communicate that way. We're always looking for people to add to our email list for our notices, and we're looking for organizations to join the coalition. And also, there should be a Google form for you to do it right now, to just do a quick while you're watching this now. It should be in the chat also, and you can fill that out. All we're asking is your email, and you'll get some notices from us. Okay, some questions that people at RPM had prepared for our panelists. And this has been covered a little bit, Michael, but how about this? We know that resisting imperialism and working against it is necessary to create a just world. What's the problem with defining anti-imperialism as opposition to U.S. regime change operations?
Okay, well, I think I've already begun on that question, so I'll just elaborate. I think I'll elaborate in 2 or 3 ways here. Well, first, as I discussed above, anti-imperialism needs to have some kind of real content, real social content. I mean, I grew up as an anti-imperialist, but what did that mean to me? To me, it meant that imperialism, by definition, is something oppressive. We should support any struggle against imperialist oppression, and oppression carried out by direct allies, or regimes backed by these imperialist powers, and that, I think, it goes without saying. I started being political at the age of 13 because the Vietnam War was still on, and I thought that in a few years I might get taken off to this war, so I wanted to know what it was about, and then I decided that I supported the struggle of the Vietnamese against U.S. imperialism, because U.S. imperialism was raining down bombs and napalm and everything else on a poor country. Then again, there's the struggles of the peoples in Central America during the 1980s, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and so on. Guatemala, once again, against U.S. imperialism and against regimes backed by dictatorships backed by U.S. imperialism. there's the long, decades-long struggle of the Palestinian people against an apartheid regime, a regime of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, a regime backed unconditionally by the United States, no matter what violation of international law and human rights it carries out. Therefore, to be consistent, I mean, this isn't just a label. This isn't an image. This is principle. So, therefore, to be consistent, we must support all struggles against oppression, including when they're carried out by non-imperialist repressive states, or even in some cases, states that have some kind of conflict, real or imaginary, with imperialism. So in some cases, sure, imperialist countries are going to maneuver, and that they won't always be so obviously on the side of the oppressor. Although I think if you do a deep analysis, then fundamentally they usually are. But that doesn't always take the form of direct support, because the regime might be doing stuff that is just going to create an unstable situation. So sometimes they might verbally condemn the oppressor. In some cases, they might even act against an oppressor. So let's say a lot of the anti-imperialists are talking about US intervention in Syria. Of course, there hasn't been US intervention in Syria against the Assad regime, but there has been US intervention in Syria beginning in 2014, when US imperialism stepped in to help the Kurdish people of Kobani defend themselves against the onslaught of the genocidal ISIS regime, Daesh regime. That's the actual US intervention. So does that mean we should say, well, because there was US intervention, we should therefore support ISIS because it's fighting US imperialism, and we should condemn the Kurds of Kobani as agents of imperialism? And yet, very, very few people, very few of the so-called anti-imperialists actually go that far. But that's sort of the logic of it. And we're saying no, regardless of US intervention, the key struggle there was still the right of the Kurds to defend themselves from genocidal ISIS, right? Just as it's the right of other Syrian people to defend themselves against the genocidal Assad regime. In every case, we must see the actual struggles of the oppressed peoples as the center of our analysis and our solidarity, rather than whatever maneuvers some imperialist power is carrying out. Secondly, while in the immediate post-Cold War, some of the cause of this disorientation was a perception that the US had emerged as the only standing imperialist power, the so-called the unipolar moment, right? That the European and Japanese imperialism were simply satellites, and that, well, the Soviet Union had collapsed. It was no longer a rival. China was just a poor country, and so on. We need to recognize now that that's not the case anymore, that it's a multipolar world, and that both Russia and China, in their own ways, quite different ways, have emerged as imperialist powers. And I mean that not simply in the sense of expansionism. I mean, you could say that the Soviet Russia was always imperial in its way as well. But I mean in terms of capitalist imperialism. They're both capitalist imperialist powers. So the old disputes about what is the Soviet Union doesn't even matter anymore, because no one argues that Putin's regime is a socialist country. It's the country of the oligarchs. So Russian expansionism is expansionism of a capitalist great power, like the expansion of US capitalism, and so on. In the case of Syria, the intervening imperialist power is Russia, not the US. Right. So it's Russia that's, if you look at the Vietnam analogy, it's Russia that's waging a horrific air war against the Syrian people on behalf of a fascistic regime, which was already waging its own horrific air war against its own people. The struggle of the Syrian people from 2015, therefore, has sort of been partially transformed into a direct anti-imperialist struggle against Russian imperialism. Although it was, already partially, Russia was already heavily, massively backing the regime even before 2015. So you could say that's similar to the American backing of the Saudi regime or of Israel, or the Salvadorian regime in the 80s and so on and so on. So it's not the US, but Russia bombing the hell out of Syria, or rather when the US, the US has also been bombing the hell out of part of Syria in the east. In fact, it destroyed the city of Raqqa in eastern Syria, but that was in the US's war against ISIS, not against Assad. Yet a lot of the anti-imperialist left will try to tell you that the US has been supporting ISIS against Assad. I mean, this is the most absolutely mind-blowing rendition of reality. And this is another very important point about this this kind of anti-imperialist left. Their very, very strong belief that actual facts needn't have anything to do with their analysis. For example, one of these people, Ben Norton, when in the case of Myanmar, I think he wrote, this idea that there's a people struggle against a stolen election and they're being mowed down with guns. I mean, this has nothing to do with reality or something absurd like that. I mean, this is the reality. How can it have nothing to do with reality? The third point is that while we oppose any forcible, the question was about imperialist regime change. Now, of course, we oppose any forcible imperialist imposed regime change, such as the illegal US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which has led to, which led to horrendous chaos and, hundreds of thousands dead eventually, at a time when there was no revolutionary uprising, there was no people's uprising against Saddam's tyrannical regime. We're certainly not against the people of a country carrying out their own regime change. In fact, Marxists, leftists, whatever we are, have traditionally called this revolution. That's what revolution is. You overthrow oppressive regimes. It's a good thing. Okay, we need to reclaim the idea that we overthrow regimes. That's the way it's now used as if that's a bad thing. What's a bad thing is an imperialist invasion of a country. Let me make this clear as I can. There's never been any US regime change policy in Syria, if we're talking specifically about the Syrian case, against the regime of Assad. None whatsoever, and I can back that up with tons of factual evidence, and I've written a great deal about it. Actually, even under Obama, US policy was can be at best described as modified regime preservation. After 6 months of slaughter, Obama recommended that Assad step down. The aim was some kind of modified Ba'athist regime without Assad at the top, in order to kind of recreate some kind of stability here. The Yemeni solution. In practice, it never amounted to anything, though. And under Trump simply dumped even the pretense. Trump completely ended even the small amount of funding that the US had been sending to the rebels under Obama. They'd been sending this funding to try to co-opt the rebels. It was never enough it was obviously never enough to defeat Assad. I mean, that goes without saying. It was never enough even to hold a line against Assad. It was only enough for basic survival. But Trump cut her off completely. And then Trump not only cut off the funding for the rebels, Trump also completely ended the funding for civil society within the non-Assad controlled regions, which the US had been sending. The US had been sending this funding to civil society, just in the same ways it funds, for example, the projects for in Palestine with the UNRWA, the refugee agency, and so on, in order to allow a little bit of survival, and obviously with co-optation in mind. But Trump ended that. So it's no wonder that a lot of these anti-imperialists like Trump. They think he's one of them. No, overthrow of the regime, of the regime in Syria has never been an imperialist perspective. Overthrow of the regime, the bloody right-wing oligarchic regime of Assad, has been the aim of the Syrian people's uprising, and we support that kind of regime change.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent. And I would just point out that some of the bogus anti-imperialists have interesting problems with a country called Israel, which they're all against, except this week it comes out that the drones that Assad was using against the Syrian people were Israeli drones. And that in Myanmar, the regime that Ben Norton thinks is fine and smashing its people, it gets weapons from the Israeli government. Well, I want to call on Linda. We have about 8 minutes before we go into the Q&A from the people. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about Latin America, maybe about the resistance from the indigenous and grassroots movements in the countries, how their version of left may differ from what the authoritarians in those areas believe.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the impacts on indigenous movements in Latin America, this also entails us talking a bit more about what we mean by indigenous. Do we mean indigenous identity? Do we mean indigenous way of being in the world? Meaning that, for example, there isn't a human, non-human split with measures of value, superiority, inferiority. There's a more holistic, more respectful engagement of difference. That's one way of understanding indigeneity, although indigeneity, of course, is not homogenized either. So in Bolivia, this is a really great example in that the movements that brought Evo Morales to power, many of them were indigenous movements. And it was supposed to be a strategic move to have Evo as president of the country to be able to empower the movements from below some more. What ended up happening is that Evo consolidated a lot of power, knocked out a lot of indigenous movements that had supported him initially, but now were critical of him concentrating so much power, and was able to co-opt other movements into his administration or into his regime. And of course, the United States, when it comes to Latin America, as is the case in many places all over the world, but in the case, for sure, Bolivia is always waiting in the wings to seize upon any opportunity of a crack when movements against capital, for example, arise so strongly. And what happened with Evo was the consolidation of power that he undertook, the destruction of many of the movements that brought him into power were then weakened or destroyed, right? Made it so that when he wanted to continue being president and extending his regime longer and longer and longer, it ended up really opening up these cleavages from before, and now he was weaker, which then allows the United States to seize and of course fascist elements in the country to seize power and have him fleeing the country in a coup. And And so then that all depends. Like in Bolivia, that's a really great case study of what do we mean by indigenous movements, because Evo Morales very much identifies as an indigenous person, but there are many critiques of his administration as more being like a superficial identitarian indigeneity rather than a different way of being, a different way of living in the world, which is what many indigenous movements there and all over the continent understand. And I think that the discussion that I was offering before about how under capitalism, the tree does not get understood as a dignified being in its own right on an equal level with us all in terms of that dignity and that worth. That is actually something that can be traced to debates between Native Americans and Marxists. And there's actually an edited volume called Marxism and Native Americans, or Churchill's there, Russell Means, that talk about how many Native Americans have not been able to work with Marxists if those Marxists believe that it's the working class that is the valorized class. And then therefore you can have pipeline construction, for example, with Standing Rock. We saw labor, the AFL-CIO, supporting the construction of the pipeline because it was going to create jobs. This is an old fight and it still continues. And so then understanding that there are battles of indigeneity and with indigenous movements, I think it's really important to understand that, to understand the nuance of what's at stake, that it's other worlds that are at play here, not just fights between identities. And Mexico, a case I'm very familiar with because I accompany the Zapatistas, there we have Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has masterfully put on this indigenous symbolism throughout his entire administration, beginning with his inauguration and on, while he's creating these mega projects, the Maya Train, the Trans-Isthmus Corridor, that is going to destroy indigenous communities and destroy so much of the land in the south of Mexico. So he's doing this all at the same time. And it's shocking to see, but not surprising, that movements that oppose him, movements like the Zapatistas, get called tools for imperialism, for the United States, which is what sadly we see happening all over the world. Anytime there is a so-called progressive government that gives lip service against the United States, then immediately many anti-imperialists want to mark that regime as somehow leftist, somehow anti-capitalist, even if they're not. It's this focus, this myopic focus on the United States as the one imperial actor rather than a logic of global capital. That is what they focus on, is the specific country or the one singular actor rather than the logic that then makes this nonsensical argument be able to be realized. And of course, confuses so many folks. It's really fascinating to me how a lot of anti-imperialists in the United States are so good at understanding the nuance of US electoral politics, and then, very critical of someone like Barack Obama, rightly so. This is someone who Empire really needed to salvage its image after 8 years with George W. Bush, when there was so much heartbreak within the United States and outside the United States, and a crisis of faith in the United States. And then here comes Barack Obama, the first Black president, who then for Empire gives Empire a lot more play now, a lot more love than before. But many anti-imperialists in the United States understand this as a game. They're able to understand the nuance in the United States, but it's fascinating to see how they don't understand or want to understand or investigate the nuance outside of the United States within countries, because so many of these power plays, these seductive psychological plays that Empire makes are at play outside of the United States too. And I will just say also, when with Syria, I was not surprised at how so many of the anti-imperialist so-called left completely ignored or just dismissed those really beautiful councils that were being created spontaneously on the ground by Syrians in a very autonomous fashion, where they needed to learn how to run that. Like, they liberated their own village, and then they needed to learn how to run it. Like, how does the electricity get here? How do we make bread, etc. That is the work of autonomy. But I saw so many people on the left from above, of course, wanting to completely just dismiss them as insignificant, because really they're just so focused on a politics from above, this geopolitical playing, where they don't understand how powerful we all can possibly be, and how powerful the below is in a very collective fashion. And so then this whole thing ends up being like a chessboard above, without understanding broader exercises of power and the potentials that can come from the below. I will leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. In less than a minute, we're going to get to the Q&A, or the Q from the people watching. But I want to do a little plug for rpm.world. That's our website for the Revive the Peace Movement Network, rpm.world. We've been working on it for about 5 years, and besides trying to navigate how to support the people without supporting any of the imperialism from the US, we're also intensely worried about environmental collapse and police brutality and killing. So if you could take a few minutes, explore that sometime, we'd appreciate it, and then let us know what you think by writing to us at 2rpm@mail.com. Okay, so let's get some questions, and then maybe we could put all of us, all three of us now, on the screen, and I'm sure a lot of people have questions. If they want to make a comment, we might react to that. And our tech person, here we go. Should I read it? I agree with the thrust of solidarity with all the oppressed, no matter the regime's relation to the US. But how do we make sure that this solidarity doesn't slop over into support of US intervention? And I won't call on anybody, either Linda or Michael can jump right on.
Well, I mean, it's hard to answer that question as a whole, because it's every circumstance is specific. Give an example. If you're taking Iran, for example, we support the uprising of the Iranian people. We support the democratic struggles and so on. We should condemn moves and actively oppose moves towards war against Iran by the US government. How you do it in practice is going to depend on the specific circumstances. I gave, maybe a question to some of the audience. I actually gave the example of the actual armed US intervention in Syria, which, as I pointed out, was not against the Assad regime. It was actually against ISIS. Although, mind you, when they came in and started bombing ISIS, they also bombed quite a lot of rebel groups, which is not widely known. Now, what do you say in that case? What do you say when Kurdish people of Kobani were up in a corner and called for someone to help them stop the ISIS onslaught? I think that's a dilemma, not just for us here on the panel. Don't be hypocritical. Oh, sorry, that wasn't addressed to that question. I mean, that question is a question that we all have, all right? But that is directed at those who are hypocritical about this. What do you say?
And those people in Kobane did get some U.S. military support. I remember reading, they had the ability to use an iPad to say, X here, blow it up. And the U.S. did that for a while. I didn't hear these anti-imperialists yelling and screaming about that. But Linda, did you want to chime in here?
It's a really tough question, and I think that we should lean into that discomfort. I remember with Libya and the movement against Gaddafi in early 2011, how at first I started to see a lot of movements saying no NATO and no Gaddafi. And this is from progressive media. I remember Democracy Now! Was starting to say that, but then later Democracy Now! Was just talking about NATO intervention or staying with Gaddafi, and wasn't talking about a possible other space or other alternative. And I feel like that for a place like Democracy Now! For journalists who are truly trying to seek another world, I feel like that we really needed a lot more attention on what ideas on the ground there were to not support a NATO intervention and to not support Gaddafi. But we didn't hear about that, even though we were gestured to them, or they were gestured to us in the beginning. Obviously, like, this is a really tough question, especially speaking from a place like the United States, which is a container that is relatively less violent than other places all over the world. So it's a really difficult thing to talk about from the United States, telling other people, no, don't get US intervention. And I'm, of course, like, for me, US intervention is something that if I'm gonna ally with other movements all over the world and I'm against empire, like, yikes, if you are seeking US intervention, then you're making the other side a lot stronger, but so it's a massive point of discomfort for me. But I do feel that conversation needs to be had with movements, between movements, and it's hard for me to really take seriously, like, armchair people talking about it when they're very comfortable where they're at. And another point too is the question of self-defense, violence for self-defense. So much of the anti-war movement is focused on peace, without really recognizing how violence is how these tools, how these armaments, how military weapons, how prolific they are everywhere, all over the world. So what alternative are we going to create to prevent some kind of US intervention to, quote unquote, save folks or prevent violence on folks? Like, do we have an alternative? Maybe we need to start talking about that. So I leave it at that as a question I think is really important. And I think that we do need to lean into the discomfort, but it's a question for movements to have. I don't know that it can be a question that can be answered by people that aren't part of movements, where there isn't, like, stakes on the ground, life and death stakes on the ground for them.
Thanks.
Can I just add something else there? Can I make another point, Stan?
Yeah, sure.
I agree. I mean, this is about movements, and when movements when it's a matter of defending their actual existence, we do need more than simply armchair socialists in the United States or Australia simply saying no intervention and that's that. Now, in Australia, we actually had the situation of East Timor, where the Indonesian dictatorship of Suharto, the imperialist-backed dictatorship, which had invaded East Timor and killed hundreds of thousands of people there. Well, when there was an uprising for when there was the referendum for independence in 1999, and the Indonesian regime was carrying out a massacre, parts of the left in Australia not only supported Australian intervention, they even called for it. Who was calling for it, though? The East Timorese resistance was calling for it. Now, this was a huge dilemma, because yes, people were saved from being slaughtered. That's a simple fact. At the same time, by going in, the Australian ruling class then had a strong position in East Timor, and has influenced a kind of development there. And meanwhile, the Australian government has been cheating the East Timorese out of their oil. So it certainly is acting as an imperialist overlord. But what's there in that at that immediate time? I mean, the East Timorese people simply didn't have the ability with weaponry to defend themselves against slaughter. This is a discussion that's not for us to answer. Like we're not the sages that have all the answers here. That's up to you to answer as well. That's up to you to have a discussion about and to listen to actual people on the ground that are fighting and that are suffering and that are resisting. Good.
Could you flash that question again from James Clement Van Pelt? And the question was Castro a despot, and the leaders of China, Vietnam, or Bhutan?
I think Cuba, I imagine Fidel Castro, so they're talking about. So with Cuba is a very interesting case in that it is a left from above, a left in the sense that it is socialist, not just anti-US. It's the left from above. It's not my type of politics, the politics that I would like in my life. It is an interesting case, though, in terms of the types of autonomous practices that have been made possible within Cuba, and so that's something to really investigate, to learn from. For example, the ability, like what happened with the special period when the Soviet Union fell, how there was a massive crisis for Cuba because the Soviet Union had been funding Cuba. For the Zapatistas and other movements, it was a relief that the Soviet Union fell, because now there wasn't a hegemony on what communism was or what anti-capitalism was, right? But for Cuba, it was a crisis because of that support, that dependency. But what the regime did, it was empower people on the ground to, for example, learn to grow their own food in urban. They have this massive, it's like a mecca of urban gardening now in Cuba. And so that's an interesting case in terms of what is allowed. So I think it is really important to differentiate between a regime like Assad and a regime like Assad's and a regime like Castro's, not so much because one is necessarily better than the other, but because it depends, and that will depend on what the ground is doing and what is possible for the ground. And to give a more concrete example for folks familiar with the US or those of us in the United States, the question of, was having a Black president a positive thing or a negative thing? Many people would think that it was just immediately positive because of representation, it's important. But for others, they would say it was a negative thing. It destroyed a lot of the radical consciousness of Black people in this country. And so now we have to start all over. So then that depends on like what openings are available. And maybe it was a positive thing in that, now we had a Black president, and now we see that really wasn't the solution to the problem. And so then we can expand beyond what solutions to problems could be. So this differentiation, I think, is important, not to say that one is better than the other, but each one as a case study, I think, is really important for movements who are committed to a left from below, to see what openings are available or are made possible and which ones are foreclosed.
All right, why don't we go on to the next question? How much can be blamed on RT and gray zone style journalism's bloggers? Mike or Linda?
Well, I suppose a great deal. Look, I mean, RT is funding, Russia is funding a lot of journalists, and this is partly responsible for a lot of this kind of journalism. But I don't really have the details. I don't know that it's the primary cause of it. or whatever, but Russia's certainly taken advantage of it. This style of journalism, I've been observing it from the left since the early 1990s. Like I was talking about with Yugoslavia at a time when you didn't have this very activist kind of RT style stuff going on at the time. It is this kind of anti-imperialist, so-called anti-imperialist journalism, which with no socialism or no actually existing socialism in the world anymore, had to find a kind of voice, and found this kind of fairly standard voice which says X movement is backed by CIA, Zionists, Illuminati, this kind of discourse, and jihadis and so on, and it's repeated endlessly for all these movements that don't fit into their kind of framework. Now, RT's come in on top. This very activist RT has come in on top of all that, and made it a lot worse, made it a lot more hegemonic, if you like, in large parts of the left. Grey Zone itself, I mean, Grey Zone's a little bit of a contradiction, because it's led by a number of people who, in the earlier years of the Syrian revolution, were very, very active supporters of it, and then suddenly flipped around 2015, and just before they flipped, there were events like Max Blumenthal having a dinner in Moscow and stuff like that. Now, what that proves, I don't know, but I mean, you can make up your own minds about that. I mean, Max and Ben and so on then kind of got rid of all their social media posts for years that had shown their strong support for the Syrian people's uprising, and went on to display all this kind of stupid discourse about CIA-backed jihadis that they'd rejected before. It's a little bit of an odd case. There's been others like Global Research and so on, which were always much more consistent for decades with this kind of so-called anti-imperialist journalism.
Linda, did you want to make a remark or go on to the next?
Yeah, and we can go into the next, because I haven't been reading Grey Zone for a couple of years. So the last thing that I read was a recent piece, I think, on Ecuador. And what I got from it was that the way it understands right wing and left wing is right wing is United States, left wing is anything anti-United States, which I didn't think was helpful, but it was helpful for me to read so I could try to understand where they were coming from, because I think it's really important, especially with folks that we disagree with, to try to understand like what's making sense to them. And this is why we really can't have this conversation, because our working definitions are different.
Before we get to Susan's question, I just wanted to talk about a media outlet, because the RPM folks did want to talk about media. I want to talk about a media outlet that is not in this Grey Zone category, but on Syria anyway, is troubling. Democracy Now! I listen to it every day. And in the month that the world, or many people in the world, talked about the 10th anniversary of the uprising, Democracy Now! Had nothing about it. The only thing on the very day that they marked, they mentioned the UN. The UN said this and that. The UN that betrayed the Syrian people right and left. And that was really troubling. And in earlier years, they've had many great people. They had Razan Zaitouna in the year of the gas attack in 2013, a few months before she was murdered. And personally, more than anything else, listening to her about Syria just was overwhelming and convincing. All right. I hope if any Democracy Now! Producers are listening, they should reform themselves. All right. Susan Smith's question. Can you talk about the ego and arrogance of some on the left in denying indigenous resistance movements, their cognitive dissonance, and prioritizing ideology over lives and clear conscience. You know, Linda, you've talked about that some. Maybe elaborate a little more.
Sure. I mean, I've referenced the Zapatistas before, and I think that they're such a great case study, and especially because they're a movement that has gained the respect of the entire world, and they're still in resistance since the world learned about them in 1994. But they started in 1983, and the way that they started, I think, can really speak to Susan's question in that it was 6 Marxist-Leninists who go into the jungles of Chiapas, of the southernmost state of Mexico near the Guatemala border, and assume that they're going to tell the indigenous people what to do and that they have the correct ideological line for resistance. But what they find is that the indigenous peoples are already organized, and they're organized in already anti-capitalist and non-capitalist ways. Like, that's just the way that they live is non-capitalist. And they were organized in lots of ways through liberation theology, which was this idea of not imposing the word on God on anyone, but finding the word of God within the everyday practices of the people. So, which liberation theology itself was humble, was a movement by humble clergy who realized, oh shoot, we don't really know that much. Maybe we can learn from the indigenous people. And that's what happened with these first 6 Marxist-Leninists of the Zapatista movement, of the EZLN, that they thankfully humbled themselves down and realized that they had a lot to learn from the indigenous peoples, and they were able to provide the indigenous peoples a lot of information about what was happening all over the world, because so many indigenous peoples in Mexico at the time were very isolated. They just wanted to protect themselves and not coordinate with others. And so what these 6 first Zapatistas did was be able to have bigger conversations with them about the global processes of capitalism and neoliberalism. And that humbling of those Marxist-Leninists was very key for the Zapatista movement to be what it is now. And they talk about, you know, we shit on the vanguard. You know, they've done away with this idea of a vanguard, and continue asking questions while they walk. There's so much more to say about them, but if anyone is interested, reading the 6th Declaration, which I've mentioned before, it's their own words of what their own history is, and how they see the world and how they're trying to organize. And I think that can be really helpful for folks trying to learn more about a movement that works actively to strip away this ego and arrogance. And even to this day, when I go to Zapatista territory, when they have these encounters where they invite people from all over the world, there are people with light skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, but there are not white people as we know them. They're not structurally superior. They're not this arrogant. They're just white adjective. We're all different. We're all there. Like it really is another world, and it's because this idea of arrogance is really warded off, and what's favored is the notion of dignity for all beings.
We should put that declaration up on the RPM website, so please do send it to us. Michael, could I ask you something about Australia and the indigenous there? We in the West here, or in the US anyway, know very little about it. Then we'll get to Fabio Bosco's question.
You want to know about the indigenous movement in Australia, or the issues and so on? We have the indigenous question in Australia is a major question, obviously, because we basically live on a dispossessed continent, and the indigenous Australian people, the Aboriginal people, suffer from extremely high rates of incarceration, police brutality, extremely poor conditions of health and so on. Basically, you know, global South conditions of healthcare and so on. So we have we've had a movement, an active Aboriginal movement, actually since well, in some ways since the 1930s, but certainly since the late 1960s, it's been a major factor in Australian politics. And so issues such as land rights came out as a very major, as a very major issue for the Aboriginal movement, as well as, various other, as well as all the other issues. And that was a struggle that eventually even the High Court was forced to recognise that, yes, Aboriginal people had prior sovereignty in Australia. That was back in 1993, the Mabo decision. And yet, in reality, the kind of land rights Aboriginal people have won have mostly been in areas that that no one else wants. And so, and even on those areas, they don't have the right to veto mining, for example. So yeah, in terms of Indigenous movement, that's how the Indigenous movement of Australia is very fundamental to our politics.
Great, thanks. Well, we're coming to our last 5 minutes. I don't think we have a question from the viewers, but maybe Linda, I asked the question. You could ask one of me, or well, we have something about Cuba here. It wasn't exactly a question, but it's a statement. I'll just read it. The Cuban Revolution main weakness is lack of any workers' democracy from day one. Dissent has always been crushed. We should stand for democratic rights in Cuba as well. The response to that?
Yeah, friends and I try. Well, we try mostly by doing political education there, just having conversations with friends, but also at the same time being very careful. The United States would love any opening to overthrow Cuba. So this is this is a question for movements. I think what's really important, and when I talk about movements, I mean movements that are organized, have goals, have principles, understand the difference between strategy and tactics, and then can understand anything as a possible tool, a tactic that can be discarded or not according to their strategy, which they themselves devise. And I think that that's lacking in a lot of movement. I think, for example, and someone mentioned Hezbollah. I was stunned in when I first learned about this in Palestine. Well, I went to Palestine to live there, to do a lot of work there, coming from Latin America, where there's an anti-capitalist fervor always. And then I didn't see one in Palestine. This was before 2011. And that's when I learned that the left kind of disappeared with the fall of the Soviet Union there too, in the Middle East. And so I was stunned to hear leftists call Hezbollah a leftist movement, just because it's anti-Zionist. And so then this is where I started to understand, wow, there's a real lack of understanding how to shift power. And there's really just seems to be like a latching on of anyone that is against your enemy, as if that's just going to automatically fix things. And so that for me made me realize we really need to build movements with dreams, with principles toward reaching those dreams, with strategy, and with understanding the use of tactics. And that's not something that I see in a lot of movements, but I think that if we could study that more, we could talk about that more, then I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand when certain things like, for example, international law, like cartography or prior colonial tools might be used or might not be used. But again, that's something that movements understand. It's something that I learned from Palestine. For example, I'm a critical cartographer. I went in and I tried to do a genealogy of the map in Palestine. I was like, oh my God, the map has ruined everything. And then a refugee camp asked me to map the refugee camp. And I was like, no, I don't want to map anything. The map's evil. But they taught me, no, the map is just a tool. Like Israel already has all these maps of our camp. And so then we had these great conversations, and they were able then from the map that I created to fix some of their water problems so that they have urban gardens now. But I had to learn that from them. And that was me understanding that, wow, even though I have this formal education, I really don't know that much. I really need to humble down, listen to movements on the ground, because for them, life and death situations, that's what's at stake. For me, I just get to go back home.
Great. I believe there was one more question. I have seen the left take sides with Putin and Russia against the Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is fascist and Russia is freeing Ukraine from fascism. They actually worry about the Russian speakers in Ukraine being victimized. How do you see this, if you are familiar with this at all? It's a big question. Let's figure it out in a minute. Mike, did you want to talk about it a bit?
I'm no expert on Ukraine, but I mean, I just don't. I also agree that this kind of labeling, as the whole of Ukraine as fascist and Russia as non-fascist, is obviously insulting to Ukrainian people. I mean, the Ukrainian people come in a variety of politics, just as Russians do. Now, the Russian intervention in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, has been in support of Russian nationalists who are not oppressed by the Ukrainian government, because the Ukrainian government doesn't have any control there. Now, the Ukrainian government, there were nationalistic elements in the Ukrainian government, and there were fascist elements that were not in the Ukrainian government. But Ukraine itself had the right to exist without being trampled on by Putin. Now Putin's come in and annexed Crimea from Ukraine, and a lot of the left are defending that on the basis that they had a referendum where the Russian speakers voted in support. But once again, what happened? What about indigenous people? What about the Crimean Tatars who were massively expelled from the Crimea, sent out to Central Asia by Stalin, so that yes, their numbers in the Crimea now are somewhat smaller as a result of this genocidal dispossession. Don't they have some kind of, from a leftist and anti-oppressive point of view, don't they have some kind of say in what happens to their place, to their country?
Yeah, and I would point out that there's an archive of articles, links to interesting articles about Russia and Ukraine on the website of the Promoting Enduring Peace that I helped put together. And the website is peace.org. And then you go to the resources and the archives. And one of them is just about that. And there's probably about 30 interesting articles that really dig into this. Well, our tech person says we've reached 90 minutes, and I'm sure Michael would like to get breakfast over there in Sydney. And
I'm on a roll.
You're on a roll. But I think 90 minutes is good, and I really appreciate our speakers for being part of our panel today. And please do check out rpm.world and communicate with us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.